Hi, I'm Ramon de Vera. I'll be moderating this roundtable discussion, Myths, Cities, and Communities for the Frankfurt Book Fair, brought to us by the National Book Development Board of the Philippines. So sort of piggybacking off of Netflix's adaptation of Budget Stress, and now that it's out in the world and being experienced by all these different cultures, I think that more and more people are realizing and appreciating what a rich catalog of mythology and folklore and paranormal slash supernatural creatures we have as a country, as a culture, and also as an archipelago. Joining us is our distinguished panel. Let's begin here with Budget Tan, a former advertising creative where he made his name. But he's been a long-time figure in the Filipino comics industry. I think he's been, as far as my memory, has been publishing since the 90s when I was but a zygote, and now plying his trade at Lego, but perhaps more famous recently as co-creator and writer of the now long-running graphic novel series Tres Euskadjo Baldissimo, which was recently adapted into a successful Netflix original animation series that was pretty popular around the world, if I may say so, not having any access to Netflix statistics. Joining us again, another panelist is Paolo Heras, also an advertising creative powerhouse who is also a multi-hyphenate, multiple threat, a filmmaker, a publisher, an editor, an author, a founder of Comiket, the Filipino comics and art market, and most recently festival director of the first Philippine International Comics Festival. And lastly, one of our notable horror writers in the Philippines, a magazine and feature writer who is also now the agriculture editor of the Manila Bulletin, whose collection Waking the Dead is about to make a very welcome return back to print, horror fictionist Yvette Ann. Welcome. It's nice seeing you all. For Yvette, when you started writing, did mythology immediately become one of your subjects, or was it something you moved into? How did you get interested in mythology?
I've always been interested in mythology ever since I was a child. So the mythology came first before the writing. So it was natural that when I wrote, this is what I would write about because it was what I was interested in. And when I started, there weren't any stories like that at least that I knew of in the Philippines. So I had to write the stories that I wanted to read. And I'd always drawn from stories that I had heard growing up. So urban legends, stories that I'd hear that were told as fact, even though they involved mythological creatures. So, and always within the city also, because I grew up in Manila. So all the stories I heard, they could involve duendes, which are Filipino dwarves. They could involve ikbalangs, which are the half horse, half man, except that the horse part is the head. But it was always within the context of the city. So that's how I started.
And do you have any favorite myths or creatures?
No, I don't. But one of the stories in my book, Waking the Dead, which I know Budget likes also, I drew, is called The Bridge, and it's from an urban legend that was around before I was born. This was that had to do with the making of the San Juanico Bridge in the Philippines, a bridge that crosses between provinces of Leyte and Samar. And when it was built in the 1970s, an urban legend grew around it that spread not just from the province, but reached Manila. And the effect was kids weren't allowed to go out at night. I'm not going to give anything away, but that was the effect of this urban legend. So I like how things that have root in mythology can still have an effect in real life, even as late as the 1970s.
How about you, Budge? I know you are also a fan of Yvette's collection, but how did mythology become an interest of yours? how young were you, and what was the impact?
Yep. It's pretty similar to what Yvette said. It's interesting when Yvette said that, I started to write the stuff that wasn't available to me. It's based on stories heard from family and friends every time we would gather at dinner time, or there was a certain period of time in Manila when we would have power failures, we would have rolling blackouts. So every time there would be a blackout, that's of course the time to bring out the flashlight and start scaring each other with stories, right? But these stories, again, you suddenly realize that, oh, these stories have been around even before I was born. Like the story of the White Lady of Balete Drive, this ghost that supposedly haunts this avenue in Quezon City, that it's been around since our parents' time. So it's the sort. But if you taking a look at going to the bookstore or picking up local comics, you don't see a story about the White Lady of Balete Drive. It's just become part of our urban legends and oral history. So that's, I guess, one of the reasons that compelled me and Kajo to, like, okay, let's tell these stories we've heard from we were kids, but find a new way to tell them.
Do you have any particular favorite, like, mythology or folklore or creature?
I still think the one that scared me the most as a kid was seeing the Manananggal in the movie Shake, Rattle, and Roll. And the Manananggal, of course, is it's like a vampire, but it's worse because the Manananggal separates her upper half of the body from her lower half. So you've got intestines dangling out of the lower half. She then sprouts bat wings, and she's got a long snake-like tongue, which she uses to suck out. How graphic are we allowed to get on this call? But the Manananggal's favorite prey are pregnant women. And then it would then use its tongue to suck out the baby from the pregnant women's bellies. So therefore, again, in the provinces, you would have the belief of hanging garlic by the window, of hanging a piece of metal, usually a bolo or a knife, on the roof to prevent the Manananggal from attacking your pregnant wife. So when it came out in the movies, even though the special effects were, cheesy and horrible at the time, it was still scary for me as a kid. So if I think about it now, I have still not written a Manananggal story, so maybe it'll take me a while to get around to writing that.
How about Paolo? With your time at Comiket, no, and I also, as a fan myself of seeing many independent comics, mythology is a very common subject, and it also interestingly is accommodated in many genres. There are comedy tales about mythical creatures, there are horror stories, and there are even the occasional sort of in between, which is like something like Aswanghai, right? Which is sort of, there's a quality that's almost Buffy-ish, where it's like, yeah, we're crazy creatures, but we have high school problems. And but why do you think mythology and these kinds of folklore are such a rich vein that is continually being tapped by Filipino creatives?
Well, there are several answers to that, and there are people like Budget and Yvette who love our who have this nostalgia for pre-colonial roots, trying to find our identity, trying to recreate our identity because you can't really trace it with certainty. That's part of our cultural challenge. That we don't have accurate data, and we don't know whatever data we have. Most of it are created by the colonizers, so we don't know if they're actually real or if they're accurate. So, but with another reason would be because we have Budget and other creators like Arnold Are who popularized the the genre of supernatural. Plus, we have a fascination as a culture. We have a fascination for the supernatural because it's still real to us. We still believe in ghosts. We still believe in spirits. We say tabi po whenever there is a tree that is suspiciously dark. So it's still ingrained in our this whole respect towards nature and the spirit world is still it's not something barbaric because that's how it's it we were made to believe because of our Christianization that our pagan beliefs are barbaric and it's not true. So of course we know now it's not true, but that's part of the fascination. It's connecting to who we are as a people, our roots, our cultural roots, and not fighting against it. It's actually integrating with it.
How about in comics? Did you ever try out those cheaper, sort of almost riso printed? I remember because of very lurid graphic horror comics that our school bus driver would just leave on the seat, and then that was kind of my introduction. There was like it was only like 3 or 4 colors at the time, and then basically the red of the shirt was indistinguishable from the red of the spilling guts. Did you ever
Yeah.
see those kinds of comics?
It was funnily enough, I only started to pick that up in the 90s when I started to want to research more on comics. Trivia is that Cajo Baldissimo's first comic book work was actually for Dracula comics, or well, it was called Dracula, or one of those horror comics. And that was his first published work. But yeah, I mean, it was my first exposure to Pinoy comics actually was a book called The History of Filipino Comics. And it compiled, it was the history of our comic book industry as well as profiles of comic book creators, and which is where I first learned about Alex Nino, which makes me I can't help but reflect on how we must have so many great stories from the 50s and 60s, except that our publishers back then didn't take the time to archive them or compile them or repackage them. And I think that's what we're doing now. Those are the things we have learned from American comics and from Japanese comics. You can most definitely serialize your work online or in some sort of weekly publication, but that if you want to extend the life of your story and find new readers, that we would need to repackage them into formats that would be easier to read or easier to find.
Okay, my background is a little bit different because I came into comics just relatively recently, like 9 years ago, 2012. I was in advertising. My art director partner, Tapay Pascual, was into the local Comic Con. She brought me there. And I felt I found a home because it was a place where people could tell their stories and other people were buying stories.
My journey is essentially the opposite of Paolo's because I started with comics. I was reading comics in high school and before I started reading fiction actually. And then in college, I thought I wanted to become a filmmaker, so I enrolled in a film course. My master, I took a master's in comparative literature. It's the complete opposite of Paolo's. But I ended up writing short fiction. And again, in the complete opposite, that was what worked for me. I liked how how sparse it is, how you can push everything into just a few pages. And it took away a lot of the mental labor of having to figure out where goes where, like in terms
like
of
visually,
the layout. Like visually, yes, because comics is essentially a film, except you do everything. So you have to direct. Again, it depends on the writer and the artist. because someone like Neil Gaiman will just let you do whatever, but someone like Alan Moore will jot everything down for you and you can't deviate from that, right? So I liked how fiction lets me and lets the reader fill in the blanks.
Budget, now that Trece, right, having been on Netflix and seen by more cultures than just Filipino, what are your interesting or favorite responses from other cultures as far as like do they find common ground with like the kind of creatures that you guys use? Do they say, oh, this is something that's similar to something we have in our culture?
I think the most interesting reaction to Trece that comes to mind from a foreign audience is the socio-political depiction of Manila in the anime. They are, of course, fascinated by the creatures. It's something that wows them because again they've never heard of these creatures. When they finally get to see the creatures come to life, now they know what a Chanak is, or at least the Trece version of a Chanak, right? Where Jay Oliva, the director, and his team just dialed it up to 11 in terms of like gross out factor. So now you have people knowing what a Chanak and a Tikbalang and an Aswang are. But it's interesting that how they then identify with the foreign audience and goes, oh, so you've got corrupt politicians and what do you call this, power tripping policemen also in your city. So I think by seeing our city is equal to their city or what's happening in their lives, then that's what helps ground Trece for them. It's a detective story at the end of the day. It's a crime noir story. So that allows them to easily, enter the world of Trece, and then they get surprised the moment they encounter our mythology and folklore.
So that sort of context is, I guess, a more relatable kind of mirror, would you say?
Yep. I guess we're all used to, when it comes to maybe, let's say, like a high fantasy type story, when you, to most people, if you're a fantasy reader, then your brain is already geared into getting introduced to new concepts or new creatures, right? But to people who aren't into that, then again, it helps that in our case that it is an urban fantasy. So it being set in the city, having familiar surroundings, it's interesting to hear podcasters who are or Pinoys based in the States or other parts of the world suddenly say, oh, I remember that street, or like, we visited that place when they were watching Trece. And again, for people who've never been to the Philippines, it just makes them feel, the city just makes it feel more familiar to them and eases them into the world of our characters and creatures. You can now see how the anime has brought in a new crowd to the comic book reading crowd of Trece. And of course, now they're trying to fit the pieces together, right? Because characters were changed, details were changed for the anime, and terminologies were introduced in the anime. So yeah, most definitely, we're working on the next Trece book, and that's what me and Kajo are focusing on.
What makes it Filipino for me, something that makes a story uniquely Filipino, monsters aside, sorry, not monsters, beings, supernatural beings aside, experiences like the city of Manila aside, or the specific provinces aside, places aside, is that you kind of expect these things to happen. You may be scared, but you're like, oh, okay, makes sense. It's not magic realism. I don't like the word magic realism because, like Paolo said, to us, it's just real life.
Yeah.
Going back to the whole terminology of magic realism, I agree with Yvette and Paolo. It's not magic realism, it's realism. It's part of our everyday life as Filipinos.
How we experience the world is very diverse from where we
Right.
are at a particular occasion, as what Yvette said and what Budget also shared, was that we have different experiences of the same thing. And that's how we try to make sense of the world we live in today. Like Budget and Yvette, it's really about not just looking at the readers that we have in our own territory. It's like going beyond. It's like Tresses, as what Budget said, it's now in Italy, it's now in the US, and it's now in other countries as well. So it's realizing that we aren't bound anymore by territory, that our stories can go beyond our shores, and that's a very very powerful thing.
That's actually a great note to end this roundtable discussion on for the Frankfurt Book Fair. I want to thank our distinguished panel for your thoughts and your opinions and your humor. And it's been very educational. Thank you so much.